when a secretary presses his generals and questions their work, as Mr. Rumsfeld did when he reviewed version after version of General Franks's war plans for Afghanistan and Iraq, he leaves himself vulnerable to the charge that he is micromanaging and interfering in professional military judgments. But when a secretary defers to his generals in the field, as Mr. Rumsfeld did for years during the Iraq War, before the surge when the war wasn't going well, he leaves himself vulnerable to the charge that he's failing in his chain of command responsibilities. I'd like to ask Secretary Rumsfeld to elaborate on how he decided when to challenge and when to defer.
Do I answer now?
In time.
Oh. Well, the short answer is imperfectly.
We need to acknowledge where we were wrong, but we also have to remember it in historical context as what we knew at the time. And without pointing fingers at each other, ensure that whatever it was that caused us to have the wrong intelligence, whatever it was that caused us to have the wrong analysis, that we understand that part and learn that lesson and teach it in our schools so the youngsters who are coming up now who will be the next chairman, the next vice chairman, have a better context or a broader context in which to make their own analysis. Thanks.
Actually, I really love this book because as a journalist, I'm really big on sort of trying to understand, what's going on. One of the things when you're a journalism has famously been called a first rough draft of history, and it's invariably wrong and incomplete. And as you're there trying to construct that part of history, you're always wishing you knew what you don't have access to, and you have this illusion that if you could simply get behind the closed doors into those meetings, if you could hear the secretary, if you could witness this stuff firsthand that these guys get to see all the time, that then you'd have clarity. And then you read a book like Secretary Rumsfeld's and you realize, no, actually, if you were there, you still wouldn't know what was going on. It's just not always that clear.
One of the themes or sub-themes is the importance of strategic thinking. The book describes Ronald Reagan as, quote, strong, long-range, with strategic sense, so essential to successful leadership. The book describes President Nixon as a strategic thinker, often looking 2 to 3 steps ahead in a crisis. By contrast, the book describes as a dangerous misjudgment the, quote, post-Cold War holiday from strategic thought that characterized much of the 1990s. And the book contrasts this notably with the strategic thinking of one of our main competitors, a rising China.
If you think about it, World War I and World War II had a finite beginning and a finite ending. The Cold War didn't. The Cold War kind of came along and lasted decades. And I worried about language, the idea of calling the war on terror a war, because it bothered me that it left the impression that it could be won by bullets, and it can't. It left the impression that it was the Department of Defense's responsibility and not the rest of the government and not the private sector. And that's not the case. It is much more like the Cold War, where there was a competition of ideas between communism and its expansionist activities and people who believed in free political institutions and free economic institutions. And this, too, is a competition of ideas. This competition we have with radical Islamists